I think one of the things that your work, frankly, has helped me understand is, history is like looking at the almost like the trails. They're not chemtrails of an air of a jet going across the sky. Like you could take one segment, you're not going to get an idea of where that plane has been or where it's going. But the knowledge of where it's been and where it's going, the direction it takes after any given sort of like segment of that trail, gives you a much better understanding of who might be on the plane, where the plane's going, where it's been, et cetera, et cetera. So talk about some of the key elements that were there in the lead up to the Texas Revolution. And then we'll talk about some of those key moments following it that make this case that it was a counter-revolution and that it was the struggle, the impulse for independence from Mexico was at least in the leadership of Texas about getting slaves and expanding slaves and presumably territory and making money.
Well, another epical event that's taking place congruent with the unrest among settlers in Texas is the fact that the U.S. president at that moment, Andrew Jackson, was expelling the indigenous population from the southeast quadrant of North America, speaking mostly of Georgia. I'm speaking of the Cherokees. I'm speaking of the Trail of Tears. I'm also speaking of the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, etc. And what happens there is that they're told that what is now Oklahoma would be Indian territory, a sort of Bantustan. That is to say, the land of the Indians forevermore, as long as the river shall flow and the grass shall grow. But what happens is, if you look more carefully at the history, is that Washington at that point was quite concerned with the growth of Texas. Texas saw itself as a challenger to Washington. And I think that's one of the reasons why you need to take this loose talk about another Texas secession of the 21st century quite seriously. I think that one of the reasons why Texas seceded in its secession from Mexico was not least because it received assistance from France, which France had designs all of its own on North America and recognized that it had made a bad deal when it sold what was called the Louisiana Territory to the Jefferson Administration earlier in the century, fundamentally for a song, fundamentally for pennies on the dollar. And so when Jackson places a Native American entity on the northern border of Texas, he's seeking to occupy the settlers in Texas. He's seeking to prevent their further expansion. But alas, that does not work, because what happens subsequently is that Texas is forced to join the Union because it can't stand up to the pressure from the Native Americans, from rebellious Africans, from Mexico, which is welcoming rebellious Africans as they walk across the border into Mexico, leading to major capital loss, not to mention taking the pressure from abolitionist London. But before that event of 1845, you saw Texas in competition with the United States to further denude Mexico by seizing California, which the United States proceeds to do with the war against Mexico in 1846 to 1848.
So was there, I mean, what was the motivation of Washington at that time? The Trail of Tears, as I understand it, and the sort of the Indian Removal Act was a function of elite in Georgia and I guess to some extent slightly west of that to basically get this really fertile territory. And we've spoken to a couple of historians who explained to us that vacuum. They were quickly filled with slaves. It preceded a huge expansion of slavery in this country to work that fertile ground that has now been essentially natives have been ejected from. Was there also did Washington anticipate this will also sort of like put pressure on Texas in a way that will make them less of a rival? I mean, was that part of the thinking from Washington, or was that sort of happenstance?
No, I think that was part of the thinking. That is to say, you put this indigenous entity on Texas's northern border, speaking of today's Oklahoma, and that will serve to tie down Texas to a certain degree. But one of the points you need to understand about the so-called Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, whereby the indigenous were forced to evacuate their land, is that many of the indigenous, I'm speaking of the Cherokees in the first instance, had moved to assimilate. They had adopted the dress of the settlers. They were engaged in the kind of agriculture that the settlers preferred. Many of them were living in mansions. Many of them had enslaved Africans. They had developed an alphabet. In fact, one of my major sources for this study is the Cherokee newspapers from that time, which of course are translated into English. And so you mentioned elite opinion, and of course, Andrew Jackson is part of the elite, but part of the essence of the United States, and this is something that myself and perhaps mainstream historians can agree upon, albeit from different vantage points, is that when these Cherokee were forced to evacuate their mansions, oftentimes you had poor European settlers fresh off the boat who moved in. And so this was part of the essence of what could be called the American dream, so-called. You arrive on these shores penniless, and before you know it, you have wealth. And with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, you can accumulate enslaved Africans and accumulate even more wealth. Now, when mainstream historians talk about the so-called American dream, oftentimes they leave out these grimy details, but too often these grimy details are the essence of the story.
Well, what kind of numbers are we talking about? And when we say, like, you know, the peasants coming off the boat taking these mansions, like, how much of a phenomena was that, and was it enough that, like, in what, from the perspective of the would-be plantation owners, what was the value of that in terms of their project to get a hold of those lands and to bring in slavery? Well,
if you look at the lottery, for example, that is quite a phenomenon in the United States today. Thousands, perhaps millions participate, but only a handful, maybe 10, 20, 30, actually prevail. But the fact that those 10, 20, 30 actually prevail is enough to keep hundreds of thousands participating. And so even if you're talking about a rather small number of settlers who were able to seize the mansions of the Cherokee, those kinds of stories help to convince many that if they stay in the game, so to speak, that they too can become a big winner. And I think that we would be remiss if we ignored that particular fact.